giant stones lies in ruins on Salisbury Plain in southern England. This is Stonehenge, the most enigmatic prehistoric monument on Earth. There is nothing quite like it anywhere. It was built before there were cities here, before there was writing, before there were even states and kings to command a labor force. Every year, more than 1 million people come to Stonehenge to admire it and to ponder, who could have built such a structure, and how? And most baffling of all, why was it built? We are fascinated by its possible meanings. What went on here? For years, Stonehenge has been shrouded in mystery, until now. Fresh new insights into the prehistoric mind are beginning to lift the veil. Steadily, Stonehenge is yielding some of its deepest secrets. Unlocking the secrets of Stonehenge is difficult because it's a unique monument. Architecturally, there's nothing else like it. But this doesn't mean Stonehenge is isolated. On the contrary, it was part of a whole era of large stone monuments, the megaliths, that emerged in Western Europe 6,000 years ago. This program travels out beyond Stonehenge in order to understand it. The surrounding landscape is dotted with strange mounds. From within them came the remains of ancient human beings, all with a story to tell. Beautiful artifacts and other ritual objects were also found buried under the Stonehenge landscape. These may tell us who presided over the ceremonies at Stonehenge. Farther away from Stonehenge lie the ruins of other megaliths from the same period, stone circles in the highlands of Scotland, and tomb carvings in the hills of Ireland. These too can cast a light on the meaning of Stonehenge. There are clues even further afield, in countries where people still worship beside stone monuments. Every clue can offer a glimpse into the minds and maybe even the spirit world of the builders of Stonehenge. Slowly the language of the stones is being decoded. Once it all had a meaning. For some of us, it still does. Who made this colossal structure? For a long time, it was thought beyond the abilities of the barbarians who lived on Salisbury Plain in southern England. In recent times, its construction has frequently been ascribed to Celtic priests, the so-called Druids who were encountered by the invading Romans 2,000 years ago. The Romans also discovered and described Stonehenge, but its assumed association with the Druids was based on no evidence at all. That Romans wrote about the monument 2,000 years ago establishes that its origins are older still. Another theory is that Stonehenge was built by priests from an advanced civilization in the Mediterranean around 3,600 years ago. But that idea collapsed in the 1960s with the invention of radiocarbon dating.
It was now possible to get material from these monuments or associated with these monuments, wood or antler or whatever, and date it in the laboratory, and the dates came out much earlier than had been expected, at least 1,000 years earlier. And so that was quite a shock. Stonehenge is actually about the same date as the pyramids.
This redating only fueled even wilder speculations. Perhaps the Egyptians built it, but no Egyptian remains have ever been found at Stonehenge. UFO buffs have declared that all these ancient structures were built by aliens as launching pads for space travel.
There's been all kinds of strange stories about flying saucers and aliens and so on, and good vibrations of various kinds, which I think one has to take with a pinch of salt. We've never found any clear indications of aliens at the site, or indeed elsewhere.
So it seems that native know-how did build Stonehenge after all. Modern volunteers can demonstrate how it might have been done. But why was it built? To find out, we need to take a huge leap back in time, well before the age of Stonehenge. The Ice Age in Europe came to an end around 10,000 BC. That's where the epic tale of the origin of Stonehenge begins. As the ice sheets retreated, hunters moved north in search of game. Evidence of these pioneering groups has been rare in the British Isles. That is until archaeologists made a sensational discovery in the most unlikely of modern settings. Under this parking lot are the remains of one of the oldest man-made structures in Europe. But this is no ordinary parking lot. It's none other than the one next to Stonehenge. Just before it was built, the site was excavated. At the far end of the parking lot are 3 white spots. These mark the place where archaeologists found the remains of ancient post holes. When analyzed, the holes were found to contain traces of pine logs, which were dated to about 8,000 BC. Right under our noses were the first real clues to the origins of Stonehenge. Three poles, nearly 2.5 feet in diameter, towered over the landscape. What on earth were they?
Perhaps these are posts which were carved or painted or coloured in some way so that they really stood out in the landscape and they could come back and recognise them and see them, and perhaps other groups would recognise them and see them as well.
Were they totem poles? Totem poles are traditionally the focus of ceremonies. Some North American societies place the bones of their dead ancestors in the hollow of the poles. The timbers eventually rotted away. But when? Material found inside the post holes dates from the time of Stonehenge. So incredibly, the holes were probably visible to the builders of the great megalith.
The idea that they're visible is a good one. I mean, people who are using the landscape know it incredibly well. They can often go back and find what are really quite slight traces, which are indicators, markers, reminders of what went on there before. And so it's quite possible that these things can endure over a long period of time.
The abandoned holes may have been the wellspring of fabulous legends about a very special band of people. The ancestors who first set foot on this land. Could this help explain why Stonehenge is built where it is? By 4000 BC, just before the rise of the Mesopotamian civilization, Salisbury Plain was stamped with memorials to the ancestors. Strange mounds like this one began to appear. The mounds, or long barrows, are a very unusual type of tomb. They're huge and built to last. This one is 5,500 years old. Prehistoric Britain skeletons clearly took more care housing the dead than the living, a sure sign they believed in an afterlife. But that alone wouldn't explain the grisly rituals that took place here. When this tomb was first explored, the excavators found bones arranged in a surprising way. To start with, few of the skeletons were actually found whole. What's more, they found that certain bones, especially skulls, appeared to have been systematically removed. For some reason, the dead here weren't allowed to rest in peace. 2 miles away is Windmill Hill, the site of a ceremonial enclosure the same age as the Long Barrows. 3 rows of semicircular ditches can just be made out. Here, archaeologists stumbled upon another curious type of burial. In one of those ancient ditches, excavators unearthed a number of human skulls. Oddly, there was no sign of the skeletons they belonged to. Radiocarbon tests showed that the skulls were from the same date as the bones. Why were these people reburying just the skulls in their ditches? It was all part of an elaborate funeral ritual. First, the corpses were left to rot on platforms. Then the skeletons were taken into the tomb, where they were taken apart as if to release the spirit of the dead. Their souls were now free to join a very special group of the departed.
People are not necessarily any longer seen as whole entities, as whole groups of bones, as what we call skeletons. Bones of different individuals may be mixed together. And so the individuality of the corpses at the time of death is completely broken down. What you're doing in coming into this tomb is entering some sort of collectivity. You're becoming part of the ancestors.
Why was the skull separated from the ancestral pool? In many cultures, the brain is thought to be the receptacle of the soul. Maybe the skull was a kind of relic with magical powers.
I think that people perceive their ancestors as affecting their own fortunes. I think the ancestors merge with time with the supernatural. They control the destinies of the living. And therefore, by venerating the ancestors, by displaying the ancestors, if you like, circulating the ancestors as relics, you are in fact looking after your own future as well.
A cult of the ancestors may well have been the religion of prehistoric Britons. It's not such an outlandish idea. Such beliefs have been documented in many ancient peoples, even in the modern world. In Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa, we found a society that still venerates the dead, and they use megaliths to do so. 700 years ago, before Europeans arrived here, standing stones and stone tombs appeared on the island. These too were built to house the ancestors. That ancient tradition of megalithic construction has flourished uninterrupted to this day. In southern Madagascar, when someone dies, an elaborate funeral ritual unfolds. First, cows are sacrificed to give life to the spirit of the dead. Then the deceased is taken to a stone tomb for burial. The new house of the ancestor is built to last. By contrast, the old house of the living is torn down and burnt. Ramili Sonina is from the central region of Madagascar and one of the country's leading archaeologists. We invited him to see if he saw any parallels between the megaliths in Madagascar and those in prehistoric Britain.
Back home in Madagascar, especially in the Sihanoukville region in the central north, there are tombs which are almost identical to the ones here. They had perhaps beliefs just like us, namely a great respect for their ancestors, because despite the fact that Christianity has existed in Madagascar for over 100 years, we still hold dear our belief in our ancestors, and we still like to have a decent, lasting place or a house for them, so that they rest in peace. Because if they are not at peace, if they don't have a beautiful tomb, we will not have a quiet life. The body stays in the tomb, but the spirit wanders. So for us, the ancestor is someone who can do good or evil towards their descendants.
On Salisbury Plain, the long barrows and the ditches were the focus of ancestor veneration for centuries. But then, around 3000 BC, these ritual sites were gradually abandoned. Instead, a new kind of feature appeared on the landscape. A circular ditch enclosure, a henge, was built. It was the first phase of Stonehenge. What was it for? Had they lost all faith in their ancestors? On the contrary, the henge was built next to the site of the old totem poles. More telling still was its shape, which was rich in symbolism.
This is the moment, as it were, in the development of these societies when they start to take on the idea of the circle. I think at first it's actually about seeing the world as a circle. And you get that by simply standing on a hill like we are now and just looking around. And what you see is a circular horizon all around you.
It's as if the circle was a model of the world that surrounded the Salisbury Plain dwellers of 3000 BC. In many religions, the circle was a symbol for a hallowed spot, the center of the cosmos, a sacred point linking Earth and the spirit world. The better the model, the stronger the link. The henge must have been especially potent because it seems to be an exact microcosm of their world. The horizon of trees seemed to be mirrored by the ring of wooden posts, the hills by the earth embankment, and the edge of the world by the ditch. That wasn't all. The River Avon, with its life-giving waters, was one of the most vital features of their landscape. The precise points where the waters flowed in and out of their world were also mirrored in the gaps where the living entered and left the henge.
The henge may well be the place where they meet the ancestors. There may well be a place which is available, as it were, both to the spirit world and the living world to come together in one place and do something together, whether that's a ceremony, a ritual, an initiation, a rites of passage of some sort. It may be that they came here for nothing more than dancing and ceremonies like that.
Radiocarbon dating shows that this first phase of Stonehenge lasted only 50 years. A second building phase began with the removal of the ring of timbers. It's known what replaced it from a pattern of post holes found under the soil. The pattern is like that found under Woodhenge, another ritual center just 2 miles away. Although Woodhenge was built after Stonehenge, it's thought that similar wooden structures, perhaps with a roof, stood at both henges. The structure on the site of Stonehenge must have been a very special place of ritual, but no evidence of what went on within the circle has survived. archaeologists have unearthed several tantalizing finds on the edge of the circle. In the ditch, they found these cremated human remains. The largest cluster was found in one spot on the southeast of the ditch. And here was something else. This beautiful polished stone mace head. There must have been a very good reason to leave such a precious piece in the ditch. In fact, the spot was highly significant astronomically. It marked the most southerly rise of the moon. Due to the interplay of the moons and the Earth's orbit, the moon rises at different points on the horizon. The most southerly moonrise is in the south-southeast, the very spot where the mace head and the cremated remains were found. There were even post holes marking the spot. Did the moon mean something special?
I think it very plausible in general terms that there was perhaps lunar symbolism. The problem is the specifics. And there are just so many possibilities, it's almost impossible to gauge whether any of the ones you pick out might actually have had meaning to prehistoric people.
We do know that most ancient societies believed the moon was blessed with a very special magic, the power of rebirth. When the moon wanes, it seems to die, and yet on the night of the third day it is reborn. Many ancient peoples believed they could tap into this miraculous power of regeneration. But what did Stone Age Britons believe? There's some interesting evidence in the Scottish Highlands. The people here in the northeast of Scotland were also building ceremonial centers. They were using rocks instead of ditches to shape the circles. Remains of cremated bones were found scattered inside the circle. None of them were in line with the moon. But another feature of the site was. The recumbent stone, or large boulder lying on its side, was in line with the most southerly setting of the moon.
There's not a single recumbent stone anywhere in northeast Scotland that is not associated with the moon. Some of them have recumbent stone shows where the moon would rise. This one happens to be where the moon would set at its most southerly. But always the moon and the recumbent stone go together.
Aligning the stone with the moon may have been a way of harnessing its powers of rebirth for funerals. Perhaps cremated remains were placed in the circle so that the moon somehow would take the spirits of the dead with it.
Maybe they thought the moon was a place to which the dead went. Maybe they thought the moon was a place from which life came. And we have another very clear idea of how they associated the moon with this stone, because around it they scattered pieces of white quartz. And it glows translucently when the moon is full. And I wonder if they thought this was part of the moon itself. Or even more imaginatively, did they think these were the souls of the dead returning from the moon?
Many cultures have imagined the moon as the land of the dead. Whether the religious imagination of the people of Stonehenge was as vivid is hard to say. Certainly, the fragments of evidence hint at some kind of festival of the dead.
I think that's a strong possibility. It's the only phase that we find this material, and if we look at all the other henge monuments from the country, they are almost entirely devoid of human remains. So this monument stands out in phase 2, very definitely from all the others, because of that association with the remains of the dead. The
wooden temple of phase 2 dominated the landscape. But it wasn't unique. It certainly wasn't the only one around, or even the biggest. All that was about to change. After 5 centuries, it was dramatically replaced with an even more remarkable monument. Around 2500 BC, as work was starting on the Great Pyramid in Egypt, the third and longest phase of Stonehenge began. Well over 100 stones, some of them weighing more than 40 tons, were used to erect a structure the likes of which the world had never seen. But how did the local people do it, being as there are no stone quarries close by? The first stones to be brought into the circle were these so-called blue stones. Actually, they're not particularly blue, except that when they're worn smooth and when they're wet, they do tend to look bluish-gray. Now it's these smaller stones, not the bigger ones behind, those are later, which have fueled so much speculation. The mystery is that this type of stone is only found in the Preseli Mountains, nearly 100 miles away as the crow flies. So how on earth did these blue stones get here? One theory is that they got here without human help. The ancient builders of Stonehenge just wouldn't have gone to so much trouble.
These people who put up Stonehenge were skilled in knowing what was good stone and what was poor stone, because they made their axes out of stone, and they had to have good, sharp, finely grained stone. So they would pick out the best stone from southwest Wales to bring here. The blue stones at Stonehenge are a ragbag. There is superb stone and there is rubbish. They wouldn't bring rubbish all the way, they'd choose the good stone.
According to this view, a glacier dragged the blue stones from the Welsh mountains and dumped them near Stonehenge at the end of the Ice Age. But the theory is hotly contested.
I'm personally convinced that the blue stones were brought here by human transport. I see no evidence in this landscape at all for them being brought here by glaciers.
The trouble with the glacier theory is that an ice sheet would have left a trail of bluestone fragments in the streams on Salisbury Plain, but none exist. Blood, sweat, and tears is the most likely explanation. An experiment in the 1950s showed that the bluestones could have been dragged along on sledges. Also, much of the journey could have been done by sea and river using boats and rafts. Archaeologists can tell from the remains of stone holes that the bluestones were placed in an ark, but they were dismantled after little more than a century. Instead, a much larger structure was built of enormous so-called sarsen stones. The nearest outcrop was not as far as Wales, but still 20 miles north on the Marlborough Downs, and they were many times heavier than the bluestones. So how were the sarsen stones moved to Salisbury Plain? To find out, volunteers recently carried out an experiment.
Lift the rope!
Their task was to shift and erect the equivalent of the heaviest stone at Stonehenge with techniques of the time.
1, 2, 3, go!
They discovered that about 200 people could have dragged the heaviest stones from their quarry to Stonehenge in just 12 days. Altogether, the moving of all the stones, the raising of the uprights, and the placing of the lintels could, in theory, have been achieved in a mere 3 years. In fact, Phase 3 Stonehenge wasn't built in one fell swoop. Thanks to radiocarbon dating, we can now map out the evolution of the stone monument. At about the same time, even larger stones arrive. These are the linked pairs, or trilithons. Curiously, they rise in height towards the middle of the horseshoe. Around 2100 BC, the ancient builders bring back the old discarded bluestones into the circle. And they must have planned for even more circles. 2 outer rings of unused stone holes have also been found. After 4,000 years, most of Stonehenge is still standing. What drove a group of prehistoric Britons to build one of the great wonders of the world? Popular theory was that Stonehenge was built as a giant observatory. With so many stones, ancient astronomers could have had hundreds of sightlines to the stars. But this makes it hard to say which, if any, were intentional.
This was people in the 20th century projecting 20th century ideas back into the past rather than trying to understand the past. And not only that, when you look at the evidence and the astronomers and the statisticians come in and had a look at what was being said, you find that the evidence of all these astronomical alignments really can be explained away very easily by chance.
This is not to say that the people of Stonehenge ignored the skies. Far from it. The moon's positions had once been important to their ancestral ceremonies. The question is, what ritual purpose now lay behind the building of a stone monument? Were ancestors still being venerated? There is a telling clue in the switch from wood to a durable material like stone. Stone seemed to possess a mystical energy all of its own. Stone seemed to last forever. This all made stone a potent symbol of immortality, even more so than the moon. At one time, the builders of the previous wooden phase 2 may have believed that the souls of the dead dwelt in the moon. The times had changed. Perhaps the stones now harbored the ancestral spirits. It wouldn't have been the only time that the religious mind made such an imaginative leap.
I think that the stones that we find here are linked to the ancestors, because where I come from, in Madagascar, each stone represents an individual, an old person, a memory, and that is where the spirit is. So, if someone wishes to keep in contact with the ancestors, that's where one would go to talk.
Unlike other circles, no leftovers of feasting, no quantities of animal bones or broken pottery have been found inside Stonehenge. This truly was hallowed ground.
I think we're looking at a building which was actually reserved for a completely different group of entities, very probably not human beings at all, but effectively the spirit world in whatever form it may have been.
But can we tell what did go on inside the Holy of Holies? The trouble is, the lack of ritual remains inside Stonehenge. There's really only the stones, and yet they hold the key. Their positions, their shapes, even their textures are all full of clues. It was only by chance that archaeologists spotted differences in the surfaces of the stones. It's the first clear confirmation that worshippers moved inside the circle, but also of how they moved. In each trilithon, one upright is always smooth and slim, the other rough and bulky. This pattern is repeated all the way around the arc of trilithons.
I think, given what we suspect about the meaning and the language of stones, that there may be a lot more to this, that this pairing, smooth, rough, lighter, bulkier, this is likely to be highly significant for moving around, because the patterning, to be fully understood, requires you to progress around the monument.
It was similar to the Stations of the Cross in a church, where you have to walk around to follow the story. There's more evidence of a ritual procession outside. An avenue is built leading into Stonehenge. It's scarcely visible today, except from the air. Clearly, the intention was to approach the circle along the avenue, as if the surrounding landscape was taboo. But the avenue had another, perhaps even greater significance. It tells us when the big ritual occasions were held. People in a procession filing into the center would, if they turned back to face the avenue, witness a special sight on the longest day of the year. The midsummer sun rises directly in line with the avenue. This may well have been one of the high points of an ancient ritual calendar. It's celebrated even today by modern pagans. The summer solstice was not the only highlight. Exactly in the opposite direction, the sun sets on the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. Both solstices line up to the avenue. This is a natural phenomenon. Everywhere on Earth, the two are always diametrically aligned. But which was the more significant? The trilithons may tell us. They rise in height towards a focal point, the winter solstice.
You don't need to turn round. You stand there, you're facing the most important part of the monument, as you would do in a church today. You're facing the altar. And in front of you are those two massive uprights with a narrow slot between them. And that's where you'd see the sun setting down between that slot. And that is the midwinter sunset. It's a very, very powerful image, a blood-red sun. It almost looks as if it pulses as it goes down, and it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. And I'm sure that that's what people were here to see.
But what was so special about midwinter? Was it simply a calendar for farmers? It's unlikely. After all, plowing and harvesting begin at other times of the year. The evidence from other megaliths strongly points to a ritual use. The major prehistoric centres of Brittany, the Boyne Valley in Ireland, and Orkney off northern Scotland also mark the winter solstice. Orkney had a thriving megalithic tradition. The most important monument here was this enormous mound in the middle of a henge, Maze Howe. It was built around the same time as Stonehenge. The skills required to shape large stone slabs into this beautifully finished chamber show that this was their holiest shrine. But Maze Howe had another thing in common with Stonehenge. Here, too, something special happened on the shortest day of the year. This monument was also aligned to the midwinter sunset. Why? On the sides of the chambers are 3 small niches. This is where the ancient worshippers laid to rest their most important dead. This too was a temple to the ancestors. At the winter solstice, the sun seems to reach a limit, the edge of time. In many cultures, it's only when time seems to come to a standstill that rituals can work their special magic. Only then can the timeless world of the spirits be accessed. The lingering sunbeam may have opened a kind of still point in time when the dead could journey to the realm of the ancestors. Even today in some villages in Scotland, midwinter ceremonies like this procession with a burning barrel echo the importance of this special time of the year. At Stonehenge, the midwinter sunset may have seemed like a pause in time too.
It is at limits that we find the betwixt and the between, when contact with the supernatural can be made, when the channels are opened up between the living and the dead.
But unlike Maze, Howe, and Orkney, there were no dead inside Stonehenge. No human remains have been found here during this third phase of Stonehenge, the phase of the giant megaliths. So if the hole in time was not for the dead, who was it for? There may be an answer in the layout of Stonehenge. The stones are arranged in concentric circles. Similar patterns are found in several megaliths around the British Isles. This is Loch Crew, a remote area of Central Ireland. This part of Ireland was also a major Stone Age center. On the top of this hill is another typical Stone Age burial mound, except for one sensational difference. The mysterious carvings inside give us a glimpse into the prehistoric way of thinking. Many of the walls are covered in patterns so abstract they seem to defy interpretation. There are circles, concentric circles, there's lattice work. It's a graphic designer's heaven. Their meaning eluded archaeologists until they began to look for and found similar pictures elsewhere. It's now thought that the designs were produced by people who underwent trances. Similar visions have been reported by shamans in many hunter-gatherer societies. Anthropology shows that modern shamans go into trances to contact the supernatural world. But what about Stone Age shamans? The view down this tomb offers one clue. It recalls the visions in so-called near-death experiences. Another clue is these spirals and concentric circles. They are all associated in shaman practice with the sensation of passing through a tunnel or vortex.
Now this occurs again and again in just about all forms of altered state of consciousness, and in shamanistic cultures this tends to be interpreted as the passage between the natural world and the supernatural world.
It would seem that the rock face itself was seen as a mystical surface dividing two very different realms.
Southern African Bushman shamans, who produce art based on their visual experiences in trance, have this concept of the rock surface on which they paint or engrave as being, as they put it, a kind of veil or membrane between the natural and the supernatural world, which is believed to exist behind the rock face, and that when they paint, say, an eland on a rock, they are bringing that spiritual animal through the membrane. Now, with passage tomb art, it's possible that in engraving this pattern, they believe that they are opening up a passage into the supernatural.
Did the people of Stonehenge share similar beliefs?
The centre of the circle can easily be a gateway, an access route, a passage into another world, if you like. Whether it actually happens in the sense of creating some sort of hallucinogenic process or creating some sort of vision process, we can't say for certain, but it's possible.
The gaps in the trilithons themselves may also have been meant as supernatural doorways.
They are extremely narrow. They're not for humans to go through. So I think we're definitely looking at people who have the ability to go into trance states, to move between this world and the worlds of the spirits and the dead and so forth.
But were there any shaman-like visionaries at Stonehenge? Just a few miles away, archaeologists found a curious grave. It was that of a man buried with an unusual collection of objects, including this necklace of animal bones. Anthropologists had seen parts of animals used in this way elsewhere. Shamans in America and Siberia sewed dead creatures into their clothes as symbols of their special links with the animal spirits.
In most societies, there are priests or at any rate special people who have the special gifts to communicate with the powers in the other world, and indeed, in the society that built Stonehenge, such people must have been close to the centre of power and organisation.
It's also likely that they performed their rituals in secret. The cramped interior did not allow much room for spectators. We can now begin to make sense of what may have happened at Stonehenge during the winter solstice. The sunset may have been a cue for the spiritual leaders of Stonehenge to file into the circle for a mystical ritual. As the sun reached the edge of time for another year, and as the shaft of light shone through the gap in the stones, they perceived a unique launch window opening up. Maybe they even thought they were in the timeless realm of the spirits. They had until sunrise to encounter the ancestors. Dancing, drums, flickering lights, even hallucinogenic food may have put them into trances. As the sun rose, the people of Stonehenge believed that their spiritual leaders had successfully negotiated another journey to the ancestors. If so, they must have believed this at every midwinter dawn. Radiocarbon dating shows that Stonehenge was in continuous use for 1,500 years. That's longer than any of our great cathedrals. Stonehenge's reputation must have been legendary even then. After 2000 BC, round burial mounds sprang up on every side of Stonehenge, as if seeking a share in its reflected glory. This is one of those mounds, Bush Barrow, where archaeologists unearthed the body of a male. He is still buried in here. With him were these dazzling objects, a gold breastplate and a gold buckle. He was clearly a high-ranking person and a very wealthy one, almost certainly a chieftain. But the sighting of so many round barrows on land that had once been taboo is also the first hint that Stonehenge's spiritual authority was peaking. Stonehenge was finally abandoned around 1500 BC. Maybe the power of the ancestors was waning. The people on Salisbury Plain were discovering new spiritual forces elsewhere, in rivers and sacred groves. But the mystique of Stonehenge never faded altogether. How could it? The site had been a spiritual magnet since the end of the Ice Age. Even in the 12th century, it was said that water touched by bluestones from Stonehenge could heal wounds. The more recent notion that Stonehenge was built by the Celtic Druids has caught the imagination of a self-styled group of modern Druids who have adopted the midsummer sunrise as their ritual climax. And still today, Stonehenge feeds a basic urge to connect with the unseen and the unknown.
The spirit was always in this ground, and you can never take that away. Because the earth gods, the mountain gods, the tree gods, the air gods, they're all there. But by coming to Stonehenge, you're in touch with the ancient past again. And you're back at where basically the spirit was born.
After so much inquiry, we can now see how and why Stonehenge was built. And perhaps at last we're starting to see into the evolving prehistoric mind of the people of Stonehenge. From totem poles that remembered their ancestors, to phase 1 of Stonehenge, where they built a sacred model of their world, to phase 2, where the moon was the object of their veneration, to the climax of phase 3, the stone monument that at one moment in time could launch shamanic flights to the realm of the spirits, the realm that shaped their fate.